Good morning, I'm Billy, I'm an alcoholic. And I hear there's no, I'm being taped but not amplified, which is probably silenced and taped would probably be what most people would want. But I'm usually loud enough that I'm not going to worry about not being amplified. But it's very impressive to see this many people. I always joke around. If you want this many people at a traditions workshop, you usually put it in the program at midnight and call it Sex and Sobriety and pack the room. And then you change the topic on the fly. So it's very nice to see all you. My sobriety date is January 5th of 1990. My home group, I was just talking to someone from Atlanta, my home group is the Early Morning AA Literature Discussion Group, which meets at the NABA Club, 7:30 every morning in Atlanta. Obviously, from my speech pattern, you can tell I'm not from Atlanta. I'm from North Georgia, I guess you could say. Very, very north of Georgia. But I want to say a couple of things as I start off here today. Gladly take questions. And I don't know if we'll get through all 12. That's a tough assignment for a short amount of time. But there are some things I want to say that are more important than anything I could share, to be perfectly honest. And so number one is, the number one thing I always say about the traditions is that my experience, in fact, I didn't wear a tie. I'll wear a tie tonight, but I almost wore a Harley-Davidson shirt here this morning because my experience is when you're talking about the traditions, the less you look like an evangelical preacher at 2 o'clock in the morning on TV, the better. Because, you know, people judge and they, you know, I can't wait until I never buy a tie for the rest of my life. But I always do say this. My experience in Alcoholics Anonymous, which started when I was 14 years old, till I was 23 in and out of AA, been in AA since a month before my 24th birthday now. My experience during that whole time is that almost 100% of the time, the reaction and behavior to a so-called traditions violation is worse than the actual thing that happened. And I say that because what I've learned about these is that enforcement does not work in Alcoholics Anonymous. Embracing works. Much like being a newcomer or being in and out for years, and you wonder while you're in and out for years, just like I wonder why I don't get pulled over for DWI anymore at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know? I wonder that sometimes when I drive home and it's late, why the police used to only pick on me when I was 18 and 19 and 20. Like, why don't they pick on me now, you know? I forget, you know, that my alcoholism is so, you know, ridiculous that, of course, they're trained professionals, and I'm driving straight, right? My lights are on. I'm somewhere around the speed limit, right? I didn't pass an exit and back up in the shoulder to get up. Like, there's a whole bunch of things. And that's much like being in and out for years or being a newcomer. When you finally, you know, and I'll share my experience, is that there were a group of people that I hated in Alcoholics Anonymous for a long time as a teenager. And they all had a lot of things in common. They were active. They had a sobriety date. They had a home group. They had a sponsor. They had all three on the same day. And their whole pathetic life looked like Alcoholics Anonymous. And I always joke around that when I went to my first Joe and Charlie Big Book workshop in '93, I remember it was a Friday afternoon in a hotel just like this in New York City. And I remember showing up. My sponsor had made me save like $2 or $3 a week for like 2 or 3 months. Said I had to go to this thing. And I remember showing up there, and everybody that I hated in Alcoholics Anonymous was there. Every person from every different group and every different meeting. And it was like a worst case scenario, like showed up like with a notebook and a leather-bound big book and highlighters and the real lunatics like a dictionary from 1939, like the worst you could want to run into if you were like me at that young of an age and so judgmental. But I say that because at a certain point in everyone's life, I think you finally realize in AA that you have to surrender. And if you want this thing, not that you have to be a 100% copy of anybody, not that you lose your individuality, not any of that. But at a certain point, you have to realize there are certain things that are deal breakers. There are certain things that you have to do. But you don't do them because anyone tells you to do them. You do them because you get so sick and tired of being sick and tired that you're willing to ask the person who seems relatively okay in their day, how's that possible? Or how did they do that? That you embrace that philosophy for life in Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. No different than the traditions. You can tell someone until you're blue in the face what they're doing is wrong or whatever else. But is your example of embracing those spiritual principles that will have a much greater and more, I'm a big Tom I fan, and if anyone has ever heard him speak, he's very ill and in a nursing home facility in North Carolina, and you know, you have to ask yourself a question. Do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? You know, effective is the key in Alcoholics Anonymous. It's easy to preach. It's easy to say stupid things. There's even stupid sayings like, well, if that scares somebody out of a meeting, alcohol will bring them back in. Well, that's not true in my case. The way I drink, which is outlined in the doctor's opinion and more about alcoholism specifically, if I drink, no guarantee to return to Alcoholics Anonymous comes. The way I drink, I light a fuse that is detailed. When I introduce myself and say I'm an alcoholic, I try to clarify what that means. I am not addicted. I was never addicted to alcohol. I am not a heavy drinker. I am not a social drinker. I have the allergy that is outlined in the doctor's opinion, that I've never been able to safely have one drink. And once I take one drink, I have to. My body makes me take another. And I'm not afraid to say that in Alcoholics Anonymous. So embracement and not enforcement. So then we have, you know, these traditions. And let me talk a little bit in my limited time about how we got here. First of all, I'm a big believer that if somebody, because this is what passed on from me, if somebody calls you looking for a question to be answered, the worst crime in Alcoholics Anonymous is to answer somebody's question without directing them towards the literature where they can find their own answer. If it's a question to do with Alcoholics Anonymous and all you're interested in doing is building a posse of 50 sponsees who never have to do their own work, who never have to do their own research, who never have to do their own reading, well, then you're hurting the fellowship. But I see more political groups being built in Alcoholics Anonymous, where if you're my service sponsee, I expect you to vote the way I vote, and that's not how I was raised in the traditions. But your job is to get your information, and not from me. My job is just to tell you where you may find your own spiritual answers. Your job is to form your own informed opinion. And if I really believe what it says in AA Comes of Age, the hardest lesson, I think, for all alcoholics is for us to believe that the group always knows better than me. Always. Not sometimes, not once in a while, not 80% of the time. And I tell that story because understand that when I came to that Joe and Charlie Big Book workshop, I didn't absorb all of it, But I absorbed the disease of alcoholism. That's what I absorbed that weekend. I finally left there really knowing what alcoholism is. And really knowing what makes me an alcoholic and not a heavy drinker. However, I left there to go on a kind of lunatic, militant bent to save the rest of Alcoholics Anonymous, who was dying of untreated alcoholism because they had not received the message of the Big Book. And that's an interesting life to lead, to go to your own home group one day a week and then the rest of the days go to tell the rest of the people they're doing it wrong and they should come to your group. And then when they're ready to give up on AA Light, they'll come to my group and learn about Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, one of my heroes also is Don Pritz. And one of Don Pritz's favorite sayings for me, especially about people that find recovery in the Big Book, is that the great thing about someone who's so rigid and dogmatic is that it's a clear sign of having a spiritual experience. However, someone who remains rigid and dogmatic, it's an even clearer sign that they need to have another one. Like that is my favorite Don Pritz quote of all time. And so what happened to me is that I got really active and really loved the Big Book, but I was also an alternate GSR and active in a young people's committee for the International Conference of Young People in AA, and loved, I had spent a good percentage of my first year in a correctional facility as a sober inmate. I had seen that example of men and women of Alcoholics Anonymous who bring meetings into correctional facilities that don't need to be there. So I was fascinated with the service element of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had kind of finally reached like this spot where I was like, wow. And this is just my experience. And again, if you met me in 1994, I would have told you that people were hiding the Big Book from me in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? I could tell you every person who wants to tour around the United States, and they don't like when I say it, but that's fine. It's very easy to get to a podium and use hate and fear to sell a program of love and tolerance. It's very easy. It's a cop-out. It's pathetic, actually, in my experience. No hate, no fear needs to be used from a podium of Alcoholics Anonymous. Not for a program that's based around love and tolerance is our code. But it becomes very popular because you hear other people say it, that I'm going to go to a podium and say, I was dying of untreated alcoholism and, my home group was killing me and they didn't expose me to the Big Book. Well, the truth is, you did not find me outside a door shaking people down for the program. I hated the people who had the program. I put them down. I made fun of them. I bullied them. That's who I am. No one was trying to kill me or sentence me to death. Except for me. Because I'm too cool. Which is a death sentence in Alcoholics Anonymous. Cool people drink. Cool people die. That's what happens. Being too cool to be sober is a death sentence. But I did come to a point where I felt like everybody in my Big Book group knew the Big Book but had no idea about these other set of 24 spiritual principles, the traditions and the concepts. But yet I would go to the assembly and I felt like, wow, does anybody here talk about the Big Book? And so, much like when I was out of that correctional facility and I went to my first conference like this, and I asked a taper if he knew a guy named Tom I, and he showed me a whole section of Tom I tapes. And that's how I started my relationship with Tom I. The next time I went to a taper's table, I asked a taper, is there anyone involved in service who's also into the Big Book? And he said, oh yeah, you got to listen to this Don P. from Aurora, Colorado. He's the guy who brought the message to Russia. He served as a U.S. trustee at large on the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I started collecting all I could hear from Don P. And You know, I tell that to people all the time. You know, when you go out to the tapers table, you know, there's a couple of names out there I would throw out there. David A. from Texas, Tom I. from North Carolina, Don P. from Aurora, Colorado, Debbie D. from Concord, California. I think that's the town of Walnut Creek, one of those. You will hear people who can really speak on those legacies. But, you know, I had to really start to learn to embrace the traditions. And it's easy. I know I'll say some things that are going to piss off some people in this room, which is fine. If you have one of these and that doesn't happen, because I can stand here today willing to say that as much as I believe what I believe, you might be right. Like, I have convinced myself of that. That you may be right and I may be wrong. And for a guy like me, that is a huge place to come to. And better than that, we both might be wrong. And the group might know better than the both of us loudmouths. I completely embrace that what it teaches in AA comes of age. There are a couple of things I want to talk about as far as resources. I think I mentioned them. The Big Book, the 12 and 12, AA Comes of Age, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, Pass It On, Lois Remembers, Not God. But I also want to mention a couple of pamphlets before I get into debating pamphlets, because that always occurs at any kind of workshop. I hate pamphlets. We have too many, all this. I'm going to try to stay away from that a little bit. But I want to stress a few, because one of the great things about some of our pamphlets is Billy's, as Billy sees it, is not found in these. And on the back of them, and inside, it says some interesting things. The most important thing it says is this is AA conference approved literature. When it says this is AA conference approved literature, what it's saying is it doesn't matter what the 100 of us in this room really think. It's nice. We're glad everyone has an opinion. But the group conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole for the U.S. and Canada is found in some of these pamphlets. And when I run into people, which I do, usually sometimes I'll get done speaking and I can see the person who's been waiting to like unload at me for 3 years, heard something I said on a tape and just can't wait to unload. And those are usually my favorite people to talk to. But the one thing that I safely know is it doesn't matter what him and I or him and her think. What matters is, are we willing to check our egos aside and say, you know what? The fellowship has a group conscience about this. So before I get into any kind of special interest pamphlets, I'm going to stick to a couple that I think are mandatory, should be mandatory. If you give out an AA Big Book, it should have the AA group tucked inside it. If there's nothing else to give a newcomer, it's an AA Big Book and this pamphlet. Because, you know, listen, there was a day when I would have argued, do meeting makers make it, right? I would have argued that till the cows came home. There was a day I would have told you meeting makers make it. But the truth is, home group members make it. That's the truth. I don't care about any of the other nonsense. Home group members make it. It's easy to run into some lunatic big book thumper like myself who has 4 years of sobriety and knows everything. I could go anywhere and I could find hundreds of them. I know everywhere to go to find them. But find me someone 30 years sober who still has a home group, who still goes to their business meeting, who still has a service commitment at their home group, who still embraces the Big Book. Like, those are my heroes in Alcoholics Anonymous. Not some 3-year wonder like myself who just says things to piss people off and send the meeting in a different direction because I don't like where it's going. Those are my heroes in Alcoholics Anonymous because they've learned to embrace all our spiritual principles. And the AA group is such a great pamphlet. Even if you don't want to read the 12 traditions in the 12 and 12. The 12 Traditions Illustrated may be one of the premier pieces of literature that we have. In fact, I would probably argue on any day there's not a better piece as far as relaying a simple message to our members. And I will refer to this as I go through some of the traditions. Understanding anonymity. I mean, I'll probably focus on 3 things today. The terrible A's, I call them in Alcoholics Anonymous today. The 2 other A's, anonymity and affiliation, which are definitely our largest problem in Alcoholics Anonymous today, which we've definitely redefined those without changing our literature. And I'm actually okay with someone who wants to redefine either of them. If you're willing to take it to your group and your district and your assembly and send it in for all of Alcoholics Anonymous to consider. I would tell anyone, whatever idea you have, send it in. Let the group conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous discuss it. But anonymity and affiliation and singleness of purpose, which is funny because when I talk about singleness of purpose, I go to some places, I'm considered like a liberal from the Northeast who wants to trash AA. I go to other places, I'm too conservative. I stick to what's in the literature instead of my own opinion. That's what I've found easiest. Problems other than alcohol, the excerpts and the real pamphlet. This pamphlet is gold. Especially, it's one of the few pamphlets we have that actually answers questions with a yes or no. Anybody who knows about what we do not like yes or no's. We like long theoretical, our experience is shown, some do this, others do this. Not this pamphlet. This pamphlet, it's right on the money. It's just very simple. Yes or no. Which, that causes some difficulty for some people. And there's so much in here, conference-approved literature. Now, in full disclosure, I did serve as a delegate, a Panel 49 delegate. I served as an appointed committee member on the Trustees Corrections Committee. I served as a non-trustee director on the AA World Services Board. And I served as a general service trustee on the General Service Board and twice chaired the AA World Services Board. So I've traveled, been around the world and around the U.S. and Canada, and have had my mind opened by lots of things that I've seen. Because as important as any of that experience is that I've been homeless, I've eaten food other people have eaten, I've smoked cigarettes other people put out, I've lived in a welfare hotel. Like, those things are as much part of my AA traditions experience as any of the literature I've mentioned. Because it's very easy to be an asshole in a meeting when you have a couple extra dollars in your pocket. Or you have a mortgage. Or you're not worried about where you're going to eat tomorrow. Or tomorrow is going to be one of those days where I just smoke and drink coffee. Tomorrow is a no-food day. Like, it's very easy to be so judgmental when life isn't as hard as it once was. And I'll explain it more tonight when I talk about AA as a whole, but it's because someone realized that they came up with a recipe for being struck by lightning. Being struck by lightning is very difficult and rare, as is getting sober if you're a real alcoholic, if you're what I call part of the Page 21 Club. If you're part of the Page 21 Club and you really suffer from alcoholism, then getting sober is probably less rare than getting struck by lightning. And so I know that a couple of people in 1938 realized they had the recipe to get struck by lightning. And they realized they should put it in a book to let other people who have the same horrible illness know how they could also get struck by lightning. I'm aware of that. And that's the recovery I want people to have. But I am not going to stand here and judge somebody who's fighting for food, fighting for shelter, can barely comprehend 1 or 2 paragraphs, and tell them they're doing it wrong. I am out of that business for sure. Open and closed meetings. I will bet you right now, if we went around this room, we would get a lot of different opinions about what an open and closed meeting is. If we took out the blue card and read that, that's also an opinion. That is not conference-approved literature. The AA group pamphlet says clearly, closed meetings are for AA members only, comma, or those who have a drinking problem and, I want to stress and, have a desire to stop drinking. When I run into someone who's willing to tell a newcomer, well, you can go to the closed meeting, just say you have a desire to stop drinking. That's only half of the spiritual requirement found in this conference-approved literature. You don't just get to, that's not like jacks are better in poker. You don't just get to say, that's not your opening hand, I have a desire to stop drinking. Not for a closed meeting. Doesn't mean you need to know you're an alcoholic. But do you have a drinking problem? Open meeting says open meetings are available to anyone interested in the Alcoholics Anonymous program of recovery from alcoholism. Non-alcoholics may attend open meetings as observers. Non-alcoholics may attend open meetings as observers. In other words, open meetings are not all Addictions Anonymous meetings. Open and closed had to do with anonymity. That's where it all started. That if you were a member, you could come to a meeting if it was declared closed, and you would know that the only other people there are other people who are either members of AA or had a drinking problem and a desire to stop drinking. Because your anonymity is yours, and you're entitled to handle it as you want. Open meetings, lots of people could be there. People that don't know they're alcoholic, people that want to listen a little, family members, Al-Anon members, professionals, nurses, students, anyone can come to an open meeting, but as an observer, not as a participant. That's like one of those good words to look up in the dictionary, observer. It's very clear in every dictionary I look at that participate is not in the definition of observing. Observing, unfortunately, and listen, for new people, the hardest thing to do is to listen, right? Because they hear in so many other places, share about your problems, right? Instead of share your mess with your sponsor and bring the solution to the meeting. Because they've heard things other places. So the AA group pamphlet is great for that. And then on page 18, which maybe is the most controversial. But I laugh because how could it be controversial? I know at least two other past delegates or current delegates are in this room besides myself. If you've been to the General Service Conference, the one thing you know is it's not easy to change our literature. It's not easy to create new literature. It's not easy to put your favorite edit in. So when something gets in here, it's pretty significant that AA as a whole has said this is our group conscience. And on page 18, it says the following. The primary purpose of any AA group is to carry the AA message to alcoholics. Experience with alcohol is one thing all AA members have in common. It is misleading to hint or give the impression that AA solves other problems or knows what to do about drug addiction. Now, I'm going to read that one more time. The primary purpose of any AA group is to carry the AA message to alcoholics. Experience with alcohol is one thing all members have in common. It is misleading to hint or give the impression that AA solves other problems or knows what to do about drug addiction. And the long form of tradition 3, first sentence, our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism, period. What I think those two sections mean, which is here where I get branded the liberal, is that if you have alcoholism, you belong here. I don't care what anyone else says. That's what I just read. You belong here. I'm waiting to meet the alcoholic. I always joke around, but maybe I met one today in Prescott, Arizona. Is there anyone here who suffers from alcoholism who has no other problems? Okay. And I don't say that so that we'll just laugh and say that we're all Addictions Anonymous. That's not why I say that. I say that because the first line is very clear. Our membership ought to include all those who suffer from alcoholism, period. Meaning, we don't care what other problems you have. We care about one thing. Are you an alcoholic? Or are you someone with a drinking problem and has a desire to stop drinking? If you are that, welcome. Your other problems are none of our business. Now, Bill writes in other literature, have those other problems seem to be helped by the 12 steps? Absolutely, if you're an alcoholic. If you're an alcoholic and can come into a home group of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I want to be very honest here because I've been extremely concerned about this issue, which is why I talked about it first. I am not a person who believes we have the third tradition or a fifth tradition to kick people out of AA. We don't have it for that reason. I'm also a little bit of a history geek. So anybody who wants to tell me that the third tradition has to do with alcohol, I know is lying, is a fraud, never read our history. The third tradition had nothing to do with alcohol, had nothing to do with a substance. It had to do with alcoholism. That's what it had to do with. It also had to do with race and religion and sexuality and gender. It had to do with that Bill Wilson was enough of a visionary to realize 1935, 1940, 1950, 1960, a very different time in the world. I don't care what your politics are today, none of my business. I can just go by the laws on the books at the time of early AA. When AA was started, one of my brothers was not allowed to marry his husband. I'm not taking a position whether I'm pro or anti-gay marriage. I'm just telling you that the law of the land at that time was that my brother couldn't get married. Different than the world is today. Regardless of where you are politically, just the laws of the land. For the first 30 years of AA's existence, it was illegal in certain states in the United States of America for certain people to sit in the same room with each other. That's not me having a political opinion. I'm just telling you the facts. That in meetings in the South, those kind of temporary walls that we sometimes see in at conferences, that meetings would sometimes be held with a temporary wall in the middle, with it open a little so both sides could hear. Because it would be illegal for black and white people to be in the same room. And God forbid, was there really anything of a woman alcoholic? Is that possible? Do women really suffer from alcoholism? What did those men think early on? But Bill was ahead of the curve. And I'm not even getting into the debate about what religion you believe in or even if you're an atheist. None of my business. All I know is that Bill knew one thing. All of that BS has nothing to do with Alcoholics Anonymous. If you suffer from alcoholism, you're entitled to the same uncomfortable chair and same bad cup of coffee that I am. That's what Bill knew. And when you think about it, how much ahead of the curve he was. Because it wasn't really well accepted. You know, I went to the archives room today, and I love AA archives, and today I saw something I had never seen before, which I love when that happens. But you know what I don't see displayed? Segregated meeting lists. I've been to, I think, I'd say hundreds, but I think over 1,000 AA conventions and conferences. I have never seen a segregated meeting list displayed, but I've seen them. I've seen ones that have the code, not like today, handicapped, open, closed, but a C for colored or a W for white. Now, I'm not judging those people who made them. I think they were trying to save as many people as possible based on the laws of the land. The only reason I stress that is Bill Wilson's focus is our membership ought to include all those who suffer from alcoholism, period. But in today's world, we know, I'm not afraid to talk about it. We have a little bit of a heroin epidemic going across the United States. Now, I talk about it here, not because I think we can do anything about it inside AA rooms. But if I really believe what it says in my big book, my big book doesn't tell me that I'm only to be of service to those in Alcoholics Anonymous. My big book tells me I should be of service to God and all those about me. And so what really kills me and makes my stomach hurt, actually, is how many addicts who are not alcoholics have died while attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. What kills me more than that and hurts me more than that is the alcoholic ego. Like, it's one thing if they just don't know better and they just come into a meeting. Who am I to judge? But if some alcoholic who doesn't have that problem, who knows the person isn't an alcoholic, decides that because they have the perfect program that the first 100 had and they're an expert in the big book, that they're going to somehow help someone who's not an alcoholic because the solution in steps 2 to 12 is the same, I have news for you. It's an execution. I'm sick and tired of seeing pictures of young kids on Facebook who have OD'd, who I know from Alcoholics Anonymous. So what can we do about that? Because we're AA. Well, there's a lot we can do. We can stop putting down other 12-step fellowships in our meetings. We can stop saying ridiculous things like NA doesn't have a solution, or there's no solution at NA, or it's a weak program, or they don't have any old-timers. The people I hear when I ask them about that, they've never been to NA. They were never NA members. And I asked them how they've made this, decision about branding all of NA or HA bad. And they tell me they heard it from other newcomers. Other newcomers? Other newcomers, I go to the John Goldberg rule, which is I don't believe anything a newcomer tells me for a year, right? I don't care what they call themselves because I don't believe them. I inherently know they're incapable of being honest. So, but I have to be practical at the same time. If I'm willing to be at a meeting and willing to say I'm an alcoholic and willing to talk to a kid outside and willing to celebrate my anniversary there so somebody knows I maybe have a little bit of time, if I say something bad about another 12-step fellowship, is someone else who somewhat looks up to me going to want to go there? Even though the magic elixir to save their life is there? If I say something stupid like NA doesn't have a solution, if you're a young kid who knows me who's dying of opiate addiction, are you going to go there? You might put a little bit too much faith into what I had to say. Really what I need to do is have a couple of phone numbers of active NA members. So when I run into someone in Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't chase them out of a meeting. It's not my job. It's not what we do. We're supposed to be out there doing God's work. It's a lot easier if I know someone who's active in GA or NA. and I can connect that person. There's nothing wrong with keeping an NA or HA directory in your secretary's book at your home group. It doesn't need to go out on the literature table. But there's nothing wrong with being able to help tell someone where they can go to get their life saved. I'm the biggest believer in singleness of purpose that we are for those who suffer from alcoholism. And if you happen to suffer from something else, you belong here if you're an alcoholic. But NA has done such a better job with singleness of purpose than we have. They're better at it than we are. It's funny, it's almost comical. We have the reputation of being like the hard asses. But for those of you that have never been to a NA home group, they read a statement of clarity. They tell people not to use the term alcoholic or sober. They use addict and clean. And they do it because they want their meeting to be about recovery from addiction. Same thing. I don't care if you're an alcoholic and an addict. But the literature tells me you should only identify yourself as an alcoholic in an AA meeting. You identify yourself for what you are for respect of the meeting that you're sitting in. If you're at another fellowship, don't say you're an alcoholic. Because chances are that there could be someone in the room that is only an alcoholic. And if everyone goes around the room and says I'm an alcoholic and something else, that newcomer might think being an alcoholic's not enough. Maybe I didn't do enough damage. I hate the term hard drugs. You know why? Because I am such a bad alcoholic that it seems to make it like alcohol is some kind of light problem, you know? That alcohol isn't as bad as that. Well, I have news for the rest of the world. For this guy, alcoholic is as bad as any of that other stuff. It's devastating to me. I stand here today, I have no left kidney, no spleen, alcohol is devastating to me. So when I'm in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, I respect Alcoholics Anonymous. The fifth tradition I want to point out too, each Alcoholics Anonymous group ought to be a spiritual entity having but one primary purpose, that of carrying the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. That's the primary purpose. That's the long form of the fifth tradition. Now, I wanted to talk about those because when you go back to 1940s and why the traditions were created, and I can't take you through all 12 traditions, and you should never, listen, another thing I get in trouble for saying. There is a group of speakers in Alcoholics Anonymous that speak a lot. Some of them are my friends. Some are not. But we have a whole subsection of speakers that have branded themselves experts on the Big Book. And if you used to watch Little House on the Prairie like I did when I was a kid, you know in the Old West, I guess around here, there was a guy who came into town and he had a big cart behind his two horses and he had something spray painted on it, magic elixir, and he could sell you something that would fix whatever problem you had. Well, we have speakers like that in Alcoholics Anonymous. They have convinced themselves their alcoholic ego is so out of control that they can take someone through the steps from the front of a room. When instead, it must happen in a horrible diner or across your kitchen table or in your backyard or at your meeting or outside your meeting. Now, speakers might be able to give hope, but not hope of their way is the only way. That's insanity. But yet, we see that going on today. And we hear them say meeting makers don't make it, but we never hear them talk about the importance of a home group. Because they're no longer AA members. They don't really have a home group. They're part of some loose association of people with alcoholism who get together once in a while, but will have no idea when the fifth edition of the Big Book will be talked about, not that it's been talked about yet. They'll have no idea that other things are going on in Alcoholics Anonymous. They start to do things like mix their recovery house business and their rehab business with Alcoholics Anonymous. They start to blur the line of affiliation. They start to somehow say, like I was at a AA conference recently, and someone said, I want to thank the people from so-and-so recovery house for cleaning up in the kitchen. Well, that's completely an outside issue. If you want to thank the home groups that all those people belong to, do that. But not the recovery house. We don't have recovery houses in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm pro-recovery house. The foundation of recovery houses creation was to give somebody shelter and food and let them develop a foundation in some 12-step fellowship. To let them get a sponsor, get a home group, get service commitments, start going through the big book. But listen, in my experience today, and not all, but a lot of the for-profit paid recovery community doesn't want people to have a sponsor. They don't want people to be aligned to a fellowship, including Alcoholics Anonymous. They want them to be aligned to the alumni bonfire that they have once a month. They want them to be aligned to some kind of intensive outpatient. When really, listen, there's two things that get said in relation to the traditions that can't be based on any history. So let's just talk about the anti-treatment center people in AA. Well, we all know that one of our founders was in a place called Towns Hospital. Okay? Call it what you want to call it. But if not for him being there, we would not be in this room. So all those people that are just say anti-treatment center stuff for the sake of saying it because it sounds good in the meeting, it's ridiculous, not proven on fact. It's like an Oliver Stone movie. It's almost fact, but it throws in a couple of things that sound better to sell more tickets, right? A lot of speakers do that. They want more speaking engagement, so I'm going to distort the truth. The other is court cards. Probably the most ridiculous thing said by people in Alcoholics Anonymous. That we don't want the court sending us anyone. Oh, really? Because I read a story about this guy in Vermont named Ebby who got into trouble again and wound up in court, and two men named Seaber Graves and Roland Hazard showed up for him. And even though they were part of this lunatic thing called First Century Christianity Oxford group that had only been just invented, they tried to convince the judge not to put Ebby in jail, but to instead release him with them, and they would work with him. Well, if you were that judge and you were using logic, you would have not sent him with Seaber Graves and Roland Hazard. The Oxford group had no track record. It had no anything. It was a bunch of people in a commune, right? But yet that judge, for some reason, before AA was started, created the first court referral to the predecessor of Alcoholics Anonymous. So when people want to say that, what I hear them saying is, I'm willing to say that, but I'm not willing to be on a service committee. I'm not willing to be on a CPC committee, a cooperation with the professional community, or a PI committee, a public information committee, or a treatment committee, and go out and speak to those people about what AA is and what AA isn't. Like that's, when I hear them say that, that's what I hear them saying. Because we all know that when you do service, you can talk about AA till the clouds come home, but telling them what AA isn't is more important than telling them what AA is. That's where the confusion is. It's never about what we do. It's about what we don't do. And what we don't do is have detoxes and recovery houses and all that stuff. That's for the outside world. But we have to stop bringing it into Alcoholics Anonymous. When I show up at a convention and somebody on the convention committee is like the king of the recovery houses in that community and has all their people wearing sweatshirts and T-shirts, I think it makes AA look cheap. It makes it look like you're more worried about filling beds and you're not really here as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. You're here as somebody who makes profit. And then you're going to tell me you're a nonprofit. And then I'm going to ask you, but I understand you're a nonprofit, but who owns the actual building? Oh, I do. Oh, okay. Just want to get that clear. That nonprofit pays rent to you. You're the landowner and the building owner. I'm all for recovery houses. But I want to keep AAAA. And I want the courts to send people to Alcoholics Anonymous. I came here from the courts. No one's trying to kill AA. But no one's taken the time to explain what AA is to them. And I see flyers where AA events are held at recovery houses. How much affiliation can we really want? What's wrong with just an address? You know? Or it's an outside AA event. That's fine too. And all of this, the reason I say this is because for us who have been here a while, it's easy for us to know. But not for the newcomer. It clouds the newcomer's mind. What's AA and what's not AA? I already told you. It's easy for me to find a big book thumper with 3 years of sobriety who's going to tell me everything they know. Not as easy for me to find the alcoholic sober more than 30 years who still is an active member of the home group, attends business meetings, has a service commitment, sponsoring people. Not as easy for me to find those people. But those are the people we want to be examples. Because we say this hokey little thing, time doesn't matter. I don't know where that is in our literature. And I think I know what that means, but let's be very honest. Who in this room has anniversary meetings at their home group once a month? Anybody? Okay. Quite a few of you celebrate anniversaries. Of those people who raise their hand, do you do any kind of like, you know, those things we have where either the celebrant speaks or gets a coin or the sponsor gives them a coin or get a cake or anything like that? How many of those people you do something like that? Oh, yeah. Everybody. Does anyone here have a checklist when you have your anniversary meeting? When you announce, oh, so-and-so is celebrating 5 years. Hold on. Did you pay your taxes last year? You all up on child support? All up on alimony? Were you late for work? Were you a jackass a couple of days? Like, when we celebrate anniversaries, we're celebrating one thing. That you have been free of alcohol for 365 days by the power of the 12 steps. And once you've been around here a while, when I see someone with 20-something years take that coin, I know what that means. It means they've had some good days and bad. Because we celebrate sobriety. And we hope, by the power of the steps, that we become better at not being our own worst enemy. I mean, let's face it. The inventory in the 4-step is very clear about the last column, but I like to call it sounded like a good idea at the time, right? Because anything that appears there, to me, sounded like a good idea at the time. But the one thing I know about me and all the people that I know in sobriety, anything that sounded like a good idea at the time does not get talked about at the anniversary meeting. That's the one thing I know, right? The last year, all those things that sounded great when you first went down that road, you leave out at the anniversary meeting. It is not something you talk about. And that's why I love people who are active home group members. And that's why I love people who don't blur the message between what is AA and not AA. Now, the second tradition, we could joke around, yes, the short form's longer than the long form, I know that. For our group purpose, there's one ultimate authority, a loving God, as he may express himself in our group conscience. It is very easy to become the king or queen of AA. What's almost more dangerous is the unofficial king or queen of AA. I appreciate the king and queen who's willing to be in the meeting, controlling everything, out there, willing to take the flack, but not the unofficial. The unofficial who does all their work through their minions, all their sponsees, who's making phone calls, sending emails, texting before the business meeting, all that stuff. It's just not AA. AA is if you know something's on your home group business agenda, your district agenda, your assembly agenda, you know it's going to be there and you do your own research. And you come to that meeting armed with the facts. And you get to say your 2 cents. And you get to vote. Which voting's another controversial topic. Can I borrow that pen a second? Voting's another controversial topic, and it ties right into the 7th tradition, which I want to talk about, because I told you I can only cover a few. But I'll take voting first. Active members of home groups vote in one place. It doesn't matter how many meetings you go to. That's what our literature says. One group, one member, one vote. I like to compare things to like real life sometimes. But I'm in Arizona. There's a lot of people here who have second or third homes. I know that for a fact. There are people who come here in the winter. There are people who have all kinds of homes. But guess what? They only get to vote once for president. That's it. Doesn't matter where else they live. They get to have one residence. It's okay to go to other meetings. But what they don't do is say, could you chip in for the heat? Could you chip in for my electric? We might have to put the air conditioning on a little higher because there's more people here. Could you chip in for that? Could you clean all my dishes? Could you? We don't do that. I appreciate there's heat in here. I like this air conditioning. I'm glad you pay your electric bill. I'll help clean up what I made, but, vacuum in the house and all that other stuff, that's yours. We really have to start treating our home groups like that because that's how we used to. That's how our home groups used to be treated before we became a rotating meeting of a rotating organization of orphan meetings that have no connection to the center of AA. Don Pritz used to always say the difference between a home group and a meeting. Let's pretend that the average AA meeting opens with the Serenity Prayer and closes with the Lord's Prayer, okay? Let's just imagine that, especially when Don Pritz used to say it 20 or 30 years ago. A meeting and the quality of a meeting you can judge by what happens between the Serenity Prayer and the Lord's Prayer. That's how you measure its effectiveness. Not so for a home group. For a home group, you judge its effectiveness from the end of the Lord's Prayer until the next time the Serenity Prayer is read to open a meeting. What does that group of active AA members do in between meetings? Are they bringing meetings into facilities? Are they connected to their inner group? Are they connected to their general service area? Are they going into hospitals or detoxes? Do they know about each other's lives? Are they talking to each other in between when their home group meets? Do they have gatherings at people's houses? That's what a home group is. And how does that tie into the 7th tradition? Very simply. Because we've become a fellowship of, and let me read the 7th tradition, long form, carefully. The AA groups themselves, meaning each one, ought to be fully self-supported by the voluntary contributions, and these words are key, of their own members. The AA group themselves ought to be fully supported by the voluntary contributions of their own members. Nowhere have we gone further off track in Alcoholics Anonymous than with this tradition. For me, how I've had to equate that is, when I go to any meeting, I don't need to be a big shot. My home group should not need your $1 or $2 to survive and pay its bills. My home group should be fully self-supporting by the voluntary contributions of our own members. And listen, I've gone to a lot of AA meetings not putting money in the basket. I already told you. Smoked other people's cigarettes, drank other people's food, lived in a welfare hotel, sober. I know what it's like not to have money. We're not talking about those without money. We're not talking about those rebuilding their life that are devastated. We're not talking about those that need to get a babysitter versus go to your meeting. It has nothing to do with that. What we're talking about is people who are back on their feet, who would rather put a couple of dollars in every meeting they go to than take care of their own home group. And so I have to make sure that when I look at the amount of money that I spend a month averagely on going to meetings, what is that total? How much of it is going to my home group? Or am I just equally dispersing it all over AA because I'm a good guy, but I'm not going to pay attention to the seventh tradition? I have to really take heart to that. And again, for me, it's very simple. I'm a deeded owner of that group. I have a responsibility for the common area, the common space, the meeting space, our food, our heat, our electric, our insurance. That's my responsibility. And just like if you own a condo, you go to your HOA meeting, well, then I go to my business meeting. I want to quickly talk about anonymity. I love this pamphlet. The PI workbook is good. Press, radio, and film expanded in service pieces to TV and media, other public media, internet, blah, 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 blah. What does that mean? I don't use my last name in public. Not when I'm talking for AA. What does it mean? My full face can't identify me, picture as an AA member. We just don't do that. But yet today I see these websites, wearenotanonymous.org, telling young people to take their pictures and put their story up there. That's why sponsorship is so important. It's not because I don't want to fight the stigma. I can decide when to disclose I'm an alcoholic, but I don't need to have AA's reputation based on me. And the other thing is I'm kind of a big book thumper. I'll go back to page 21. If you are a real alcoholic, your DNA is not wired to be famous for being sober. It is not in our DNA. It is not in our DNA to be famous for being sober. A lot of people out there want to be famous for being sober. A lot of these big book speakers have now affiliated with treatment centers and put their name on their treatment center website and where they're going to speak next. I can't be famous for being sober. It's insanity. But 12-step anonymity is really where we've fallen down. There's as much anonymity talked about in the 12-step as there is the 11th. It's just not the public kind. It's the part that goes against every alcoholic, the ego, humility. You know, what am I going to do? Post on social media somewhere, go into the meeting tonight, but I didn't say AA? Or I'm going to put a big Roman numeral so that everybody else knows what that is except for the people that are not in AA? Like, no, I get to celebrate at my anniversary meeting. That's where I celebrate anniversary meetings. I don't need to be famous for being sober. I can just live, my life in Alcoholics Anonymous. The traditions are only here for one reason: to make sure that Alcoholics Anonymous does not go away. To make sure that all of our individual egos are put in check so that we can't participate in destroying Alcoholics Anonymous. Because we have events like this and assemblies and district meetings and everything else. But we're only really gathered for one reason. Number two might be to celebrate our own sobriety. Number 3 might be to see people we haven't seen in a long time. Number 4 might be there was something on the program we were interested in. But the number 1 reason of every Alcoholics Anonymous entity is we're here for the person not here yet. That's it. Period, end of sentence. I have a duty that the AA today is like the AA was on January the 5th of 1990. And I have a duty to make sure that the AA that was here to receive me is here to receive the people that came in. And the only way you can do that is through studying our literature and our traditions. And again, I said every big book. In my estimation, it would be easiest if every big book was handed out like this. A Problems Other Than Alcohol pamphlet, an AA group pamphlet, and a big book. But the other thing we can do is we can stop being one legacy members. We don't need any more one legacy members. We have 3 legacies. That doesn't mean you have to be a delegate. Doesn't mean you have to be a trustee. You don't even have to be a GSR. I don't care. But it means you know service is important. It means you know unity is important. It means you know recovery is important. And it means you know it's an equal-sided triangle. Equal on all 3 sides. There might be one side you like to play in more often, but the other 2 sides need to be equally sized, which means it should be a crime to take someone through the big book and when they're done, not tell them you're next going through the traditions. I'm not saying everyone needs to go through the concepts. I'm not. I'm a past trustee. I'm a service geek, whatever you want to call me. But you can't welcome someone to Alcoholics Anonymous and take them through this book and send them out in Alcoholics Anonymous unarmed with the traditions. You're setting them up for failure. It should be the first thing that's done. Okay, we're done with the book. Great, your amends are current. Awesome. We're going to start meeting to go through the 12 traditions. That's why I can't take everyone through the 12 traditions this morning. I can say enough to maybe pique your interest, and maybe you find someone that's been through them. So with that, I'll just ask for in 5 minutes, does anyone have a burning question you're dying to ask? I would gladly take it if it's not too controversial. If it's controversial, we'll go to the hospitality room and get a cup of coffee. But does anyone have a question they want to ask? I'd be glad to. Yes. What's a blue card? Is that read at some meeting? Yes, it's a card that on the front says this is an open meeting. On the back says this is a closed meeting. It's like the green card about the 7th tradition. Yes, sir. It was created by a trustees committee, which makes it service approval. It's come up at a couple of conferences to try and change it, but didn't pass. I think there's a way to fix that. I'm convinced there's a way to fix the blue card. Yeah, and granted, there's certain things I would tell the militants in Alcoholics Anonymous. Non-alcoholics may attend open meetings as observers, right? What's the problem there? Well, there's a couple of problems. One, AA has been our sister, Al-Anon, we've been cooperating with since its creation, right? It's a foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous. There are some groups that have anniversary meetings, AA or Al-Anon, where it's their custom, and I stress that. We have 12 traditions, everything else is a custom, but their custom is to have an AA speaker at their Al-Anon anniversary, or an Al-Anon speaker at their AA anniversary. I'm not saying they can't do that. I'm sure we could put some little asterisk there, right? We have footnotes in the big book. We're not telling people not to have their anniversary meeting they've been having for 55 years. We're talking about good old home groups, good old regular meetings, you know? I think there's a way to fix this. But yes, a trustees committee created it.